In the spring of 1943, a joke started making the rounds on German fighter fields in northern France. It was not a clever joke. It did not need to be. A pilot would hold his hands apart to show something enormous and round, then let his shoulders drop as if the weight of it were dragging him toward the floor. Everyone knew what he meant. The Americans had finally sent a fighter across the Atlantic, and it was the fattest thing anyone in the Luftwaffe had ever seen, with a propeller bolted to the front. The reports coming into Jagdgeschwader 26 that April described an aircraft that made no sense to men who had spent 4 years learning what a fighter was supposed to look like. It was almost twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The fuselage swelled behind the cockpit like something that had swallowed a barrel. The propeller was so large that ground crews on the American side had to lengthen the landing gear just to keep the blades from chewing the runway. Pilots who had fought Spitfires over Kent and Yaks over the Kuban looked at the reconnaissance photographs and could not stop laughing. They gave it names. Flying Milk Bottle was one of them. Others were less polite. The general feeling on those fields was that the Americans had misunderstood the assignment, that somebody in a factory in New York had built a light bomber, painted a fighter's markings on it, and sent it to Europe by mistake. 24 months later, the German fighter arm was gone. Not defeated in the abstract sense that armies are defeated. Gone. Its veterans were dead or in prison camps. Its replacement pilots were being sent into combat with barely enough hours to land safely, and its surviving airfields were pocked with craters and littered with burned trucks. And the men who lived through it, the ones who wrote memoirs and gave interviews decades later, kept circling back to the same aircraft and the same sound. 8 guns, 4 in each wing. Firing together, they put out something close to 100 half-inch bullets every second, and German pilots who survived being on the receiving end never described it as being shot at. They described it as walking into something solid. This is the story of how a fighter nobody wanted, built by a designer who admitted he had created a monster, became the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe's back, the Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was born out of panic, and the panic was justified. In the summer of 1940, American fighter design was quietly obsolete. The P-40 was serviceable, and no better than that. The aircraft on the drawing boards were built around light armament and light structures, and the combat reports coming out of France and then out of southern England made it clear that light was not going to be enough. Fighters were being shot down because they had no armor. Pilots were being killed because their fuel tanks were not protected. Rifle-caliber machine guns were bouncing off aircraft that kept flying. Alexander Kartveli had been watching all of this from Farmingdale, Long Island. He was Georgian by birth, an artillery officer in the Imperial Russian Army before the revolution sent him west, and he had ended up as chief designer at Republic Aviation by way of Paris. He had already built the P-43 Lancer, a slim, elegant, thoroughly mediocre fighter. When the Army Air Corps told him what it actually needed, Kartveli threw out the elegant version and started over. The requirement was for a high-altitude interceptor. That single word, altitude, drove everything that followed. Bombers were going to fight at 25,000 feet and higher, and at that height the air is thin enough that a normal engine loses most of its power. The answer was a turbo-supercharger, a device that uses the engine's own exhaust to drive a turbine which crams compressed air back into the cylinders. It works beautifully. It is also enormous, and it runs hot enough to glow. Kartveli could not put it in the nose. There was no room, because the nose already held a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, an 18-cylinder radial the size of a dining table producing 2,000 horsepower. So he put the turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage, behind the pilot, and ran the ducting the entire length of the aircraft. Exhaust gases traveled backward from the engine to spin the turbine. Compressed air traveled forward again to feed the carburetor. The plumbing alone weighed more than some fighters carried in armament. That ducting is why the P-47 looked the way it looked. Everything about the aircraft's shape was a consequence of routing hot gas back and forth through its belly. The deep fuselage, the high cockpit, the strange pot-bellied profile that made German pilots laugh. None of it was styling. It was all pipework. Then came the armament decision, and this is the one that mattered most. The Army wanted 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 425 rounds for each gun. 3,400 rounds in total. The ammunition alone weighed close to 900 pounds. Add the guns, add the feed mechanisms, add the electric boost motors that pulled the belts through under high G-loading, and the aircraft was carrying the equivalent of a small car and weaponry before anyone climbed in. Kartveli did not pretend this was going to produce something graceful. He told his team the aircraft would be a dinosaur, and that the best they could hope for was a dinosaur with reasonable proportions. When the P-47B first flew on the 6th of May 1941, it weighed nearly 12,000 pounds empty. Test pilots walked around it in silence. One of them asked whether anybody had actually calculated if the thing would leave the ground. It left the ground, and once it got above 20,000 feet, it did something no other fighter in the world could do at that time. It kept all of its power. The turbo supercharger did not care about thin air. It fed the engine sea-level pressure at heights where German fighters were mushing along on half their rated output, wallowing, slow to accelerate, sluggish on the controls. The P-47 arrived in a part of the sky that had, until then, belonged to nobody. The trouble was getting to that part of the sky in one piece. The 56th Fighter Group learned that the hard way. Under Hubert Zemke, a hard, precise, deeply unsentimental officer who would eventually become the most respected fighter leader in the 8th Air Force, the group trained on early Thunderbolts through the winter of 1942 and lost aircraft steadily. The P-47 had a temper. 2,000 horsepower twisting through a 12-foot propeller wanted to roll the aircraft on its back during takeoff, and a pilot who fed in throttle too fast found himself pointing at the grass. On landing, it was heavy, unforgiving, and prone to swinging. New pilots ground-looped it, nosed it over, and occasionally flew it into the ground while trying to figure out why it did not behave like the trainers they had come from. Then there was the dive. Nobody in 1942 fully understood compressibility. The P-47 was so heavy and so aerodynamically clean in a vertical descent that it accelerated toward speeds where shock waves formed over the wings, and when that happened, the controls simply stopped working. The stick went solid. The nose stayed down. Pilots who did not have the altitude to wait for denser air to restore control went straight into the ground at close to the speed of sound, and for a while nobody could explain why. Republic lost test pilots to it. Training units lost young men to it. The aircraft acquired an ugly reputation in American squadrons before it had fired a shot in anger, and there were pilots in England that spring who would have traded it for a Spitfire without asking what condition the Spitfire was in. Early P-47s reached England in January 1943 and immediately embarrassed themselves. The radios did not work properly. Ignition systems in the supercharged engines threw so much electrical interference that pilots could not hear each other, which in a fighter formation is close to fatal. The first combat mission, on the 10th of March, was abandoned. The Americans went home and rewired their aircraft with British radios. The first proper fighter sweep flew on the 8th of April 1943. Nothing much happened. The Germans watched the formation from above, decided it was not worth the fuel, and went home to write reports about the enormous new American type that climbed like a loaded truck. The first month of real combat confirmed everything the Luftwaffe believed. Thunderbolts could not turn with a Focke-Wulf 190. They could not outclimb a Bf 109 below 20,000 feet. They were slow to accelerate in level flight, and their pilots, most of whom had never seen combat, kept making the mistake of trying to fight the way the Germans fought. The exchange rate in those first weeks was bad enough that RAF officers, politely and then less politely, suggested the Americans might be happier in Spitfires. There were jokes in British messes about the roomy American cockpit and how much space a pilot had to move around in while being shot at. But something was showing up in the loss reports that German intelligence did not weight properly, and it should have worried them. The Thunderbolts that came home were coming home in conditions that should have killed them. One returned in early May with 21 cannon strikes in the airframe. Others came back with cylinders shot off the engine, with control surfaces in ribbons, with structural members severed. The R-2800 was a large, air-cooled radial with no coolant system to puncture, no radiator to hole, no glycol to boil away. A Merlin or a Daimler-Benz could be killed by a single bullet through a cooling line, and everyone in the business knew it. The double Wasp could lose an entire cylinder and keep running on the remaining 17, roughly enough to get a man across the channel. Then, on the 26th of June 1943, one aircraft turned the whole argument inside out. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was 23 years old, from Lawton, Oklahoma, and by his own admission, not yet very good. He was flying with the 61st Fighter Squadron on an escort mission when the formation was bounced by Focke-Wulf 190s coming out of the sun. Johnson was in the wrong position at the wrong moment. The first burst tore his aircraft apart from behind. A 20mm shell exploded into the cockpit area. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the instrument panel and caught fire. The canopy track was hit and the canopy jammed half open, which meant he could not bail out. Fragments went into his face and his legs, and blood and hydraulic oil filled his eyes until he could barely see the gauges. The aircraft rolled over and went down through 8,000 feet of sky while he fought it with a control system that was answering about half of what he asked. He should have died there. Instead, the Thunderbolt bottomed out somewhere low over France, and Johnson discovered that the engine, however badly it was running, was still turning the propeller. He turned west and started limping toward the channel at less than 200 miles an hour, half blind, sitting in a burned cockpit. That is when a single Focke-Wulf 190 found him. The German pilot has never been identified with certainty. For decades, the story has been attached to Egon Meyer, and historians have argued about it ever since, because the combat records from that day do not close the case. What is not in dispute is what he did. He slid in behind the crippled American, took his time, and opened fire. Johnson could not evade. He had no speed to trade and no controls to trade it with. All he could do was pull his head down behind the armor plate and wait. The 190 fired its cannon dry into the back of his aircraft. Pieces came off. The rudder shredded. The elevator went slack. Nothing vital broke. The German stopped shooting and pulled up alongside. Johnson could see him clearly through the wrecked canopy, close enough to read his expression, and what he saw on the man's face was not triumph. It was confusion. The Focke-Wulf slid back into position and emptied its machine guns into the Thunderbolt from a range where missing was impossible. The Thunderbolt kept flying. The German came alongside a second time. He looked across at the ruined aircraft and the bleeding pilot inside it, and then he did something that stayed with Robert Johnson for the rest of his life. He shook his head, raised a hand in salute, and turned for home. He was out of ammunition, and he had nothing left to try. Johnson put the aircraft down at Manston with the engine dying as he rolled out. The ground crew stopped counting bullet strikes somewhere past 200. Main structural longerons in the rear fuselage were severed. Control cables were hanging by strands. The armor plate behind the seat had absorbed a direct hit that would otherwise have gone through his spine. The story went around both air forces within weeks, and the two sides drew different conclusions from it. American engineers realized they had built something tougher than their own specifications claimed. German pilots filed reports that their own intelligence officers initially refused to believe because the numbers did not make sense. No fighter absorbed a full ammunition load from a Focke-Wulf 190 and flew home. Robert Johnson finished the war with 27 victories. He always said he was a mediocre pilot who happened to be strapped into an extraordinarily forgiving aircraft, which was false modesty, but only partly. While that was happening, the American squadrons were solving the tactical problem, and they solved it by giving up on fighting the German way entirely. Zemke worked it out through cold analysis. The P-47 was never going to win a turning fight, so pilots would stop entering turning fights. It was never going to outclimb a 109 in a sustained climb, so pilots would stop trying to climb with them. What the aircraft had was altitude, weight, and a dive that nothing in Europe could follow. So the tactic became simple and brutal. Get above everything. Stay there. When the Germans appear below, roll over and come down. In a dive from 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt would pass 500 miles an hour, faster than any German piston fighter could reach, and the weight that made it a poor climber made it accelerate downhill like a dropped anvil. A 190 that tried to dive away from a P-47 was making the last mistake of its career. A 190 that tried to break into the attack found a target crossing at a closing speed that made deflection shooting nearly impossible. And then, at the bottom of that dive, the guns. It is worth understanding exactly what 8 Brownings did, because the Luftwaffe got this wrong for a long time and paid for the error. German doctrine favored cannon. A 20mm shell carries an explosive charge and does far more damage per hit than a machine gun bullet, which is true and was never in question. The catch is that cannon are slow-firing and ammunition is heavy, so a Bf-109 went into combat with something like 200 rounds for its nose cannon. Fired flat out, that is roughly 6 seconds of shooting. 6 seconds for an entire mission, and a pilot who wasted it on a bad deflection shot was finished for the day. A Thunderbolt pilot had over 30 seconds. Not per gun. 30 seconds of all 8 firing together, roughly 100 rounds a second leaving the wings, each bullet weighing about 700 grains, and traveling at nearly 2,900 feet per second. Ground crews set the convergence, the point where the 8 streams crossed, usually somewhere around 300 yards. Inside that zone, a target the size of a fighter could not avoid being hit. It did not require a marksman. It required a pilot who could point the aircraft and hold it there for 2 seconds. The ammunition mix was as important as the volume. American armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed function, so the projectile went through the aluminum skin before the incendiary compound ignited, and that compound burned at temperatures high enough to set fire to structure and fuel from the inside. German cannon shells with contact fuses often detonated on the surface, which looked spectacular and sometimes did less than it appeared. A 20mm hit that blows a hole in a wing skin is survivable. 20 incendiary rounds burning inside a fuel bay is not. Gun camera film from 1943 onward tells the story better than any statistic. Aircraft caught in the convergence zone do not spiral down trailing smoke in the manner of newsreel footage from 1940. They come apart. Wings separate. Engines depart the airframe. The film runs for a second and a half, and there is simply less aircraft at the end of it than there was at the start. Francis Gabreski, who ended the war as the top-scoring American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect in the flattest possible terms. When you hit them with everything, they do not go down. They break. By the autumn of 1943, the Germans were discovering the altitude problem the hard way, and it was killing their best men. Hans Philipp had 206 victories. He had fought in Poland, over France, over England, and through the worst of the Eastern Front, and he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots alive. On the 8th of October 1943, he led Jagdgeschwader 1 against an American bomber formation at high altitude and found his Focke-Wulf 190 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air, its BMW 801 gasping, its controls soft. Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group came down on the formation from above, where they had been comfortable and the Germans had not. Philipp was shot down and killed. The victory has generally been credited to Robert Johnson, though the paperwork from that day has been argued over for 80 years. His death rattled the German fighter arm badly. If a man with 206 kills could be dismantled by an American pilot on his first tour, the arithmetic facing an average Luftwaffe pilot was not survivable. The technical assessments that went up the chain that winter reflected a complete reversal of the previous spring's contempt. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling was higher than anything Germany flew. Its dive speed was uncatchable. It carried armor plate behind the pilot, armored glass in the windscreen, and structural strength that made shooting one down a chore rather than an event. And it kept arriving in larger numbers every month. Then, in early 1944, the Americans fixed the one genuine weakness. The complaint about the P-47 had always been the climb. 2,000 horsepower was being wasted by a propeller with blades too narrow to convert it into thrust at altitude. The answer was a Hamilton standard paddle blade propeller with much broader chord, roughly 13 feet across, and it transformed the aircraft. Climb rate went up by something like 1,000 feet per minute. Acceleration improved. Water injection, which sprayed a water and methanol mixture into the induction system to allow higher boost without detonation, pushed emergency power past 2,300 horsepower, and later further still. German pilots noticed immediately, and the noticing was unpleasant. Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran of hundreds of sorties who kept a diary through the war, recorded encounters with the new variants in early 1944, with the tone of a man whose assumptions had just failed him. The fat Americans had learned to climb. Formations that expected to bounce thunderbolts and disengage upward found themselves being followed. The escape route that had worked for a year stopped working. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 was carrying external tanks that pushed its radius far into Germany, and the Luftwaffe faced a problem with no solution. To stop the bombers, they had to get through the escort. To get through the escort, they had to fight an aircraft that owned the altitude band above them, could dive away from anything, and could absorb their entire ammunition load without braking. Günther Rall found out what that meant on the 12th of May, 1944. Rall had 275 victories, almost all of them in the East, and he was one of the 3 highest-scoring fighter pilots in history. He engaged Thunderbolts of the 56 Fighter Group over Germany, lost the fight, and took hits that removed his left thumb and put him in hospital for months. He never returned to the level he had flown at before. In interviews long after the war, he described the experience of being attacked by a formation of P-47s coming down from above as being caught in something like an avalanche, with no way to climb over it and no way to run. That was the air war. What happened next was worse, because in the summer of 1944, the Thunderbolt found the job it was best at, and it was not shooting down fighters. As Mustangs took over the long escort runs, P-47 groups shifted to attacking targets on the ground, and the aircraft turned out to be almost perfectly designed for it, without anyone having planned it that way. The air-cooled radial that shrugged off cannon hits also shrugged off rifle fire from below. The armor plate protected a pilot flying at 50 feet through small arms fire. The airframe could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, which was a respectable load for a twin-engine medium bomber in 1940. Later variants added launch stubs for 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each one hitting with roughly the effect of a field artillery shell. And the 8 guns, which had been built to destroy aircraft, turned out to destroy almost everything else as well. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the thin top armor of German tanks and through the engine decks of anything softer. A 2-second burst put well over 100 rounds into an area the size of a truck. Fuel drums went up. Ammunition trucks went up and took the vehicles around them with them. Horse-drawn transport, which the German army still relied on far more than the newsreels admitted, had no protection at all. Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment in Normandy, wrote afterward about what it did to his men. The fighter bombers came in so low that his soldiers could see the pilots. A column would be moving in one moment and be a line of burning wreckage the next. Movement in daylight became impossible, and the impossibility was not a tactical inconvenience. It meant that a division ordered to reinforce a threatened sector could not reinforce it, because it could not travel until dark, and darkness in a Normandy June lasts about 6 hours. German troops called all Allied fighter bombers Jabos, and the word carried a specific weight of dread that no other piece of Allied equipment produced. Medical officers began seeing men with physical symptoms that appeared at the mere report of thunderbolts in the sector. Veterans who had held their nerve under artillery in Russia went to pieces when they heard that engine note. That note is worth mentioning, because the paddle blade propeller changed it. The broad blade tips ran close to supersonic speed at high power settings, and the result was a deep hammering roar that carried for miles and was unlike anything else in the sky. German soldiers learned to identify an incoming P-47 by sound before they could see it, which gave them roughly the amount of warning required to understand what was about to happen, and not enough to do much about it. On the 6th of June 1944, the German fighter arm discovered exactly how far the balance had moved. Hundreds of Thunderbolts stacked over the invasion beaches from sea level upward. 2 German fighters made it over the sand that morning, flown by Joseph Priller and his wingman, and Priller's run into the beachhead is remembered because it was the exception. Almost nothing else got through. Fighters sent up to reach the landing zones met Thunderbolts at every altitude they tried, and the ones that came back mostly alone. The month that followed was a slaughter of vehicles. 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed hundreds of locomotives, thousands of trucks, and hundreds of armored vehicles in June alone. Claims in that environment are always inflated, and post-war surveys corrected them downward, but the German records agree on the effect even where they disagree on the numbers. The Wehrmacht in France could not move in daylight, and an army that cannot move in daylight is not really an army anymore. It is a collection of units waiting to be surrounded. The Germans tried everything: more flak, better camouflage, movement in short bursts between tree lines. It slowed the losses without stopping them, and the flak cost the Americans real blood. Ground attack was the most dangerous work in the air war, more dangerous than escort, more dangerous than bomber interception, and the Thunderbolt groups paid for their results. What made the P-47 special in that role was not that it was untouchable, it was that it kept coming home with holes in it, and a pilot who came home could fly again tomorrow. Then, on the 1st of January 1945, the Luftwaffe made its last serious attempt to change the outcome, and it produced the single clearest illustration of why it could not. Operation Bodenplatte threw close to 900 German fighters at Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France at first light on New Year's Day. Surprise was total. At Y-34 near Metz, home to Thunderbolts of the 365th Fighter Group, German fighters came in low and left burning aircraft on the hard stands. There is a story from that morning that has been told and retold in 9th Air Force histories, and whether every detail is exact matters less than the fact that it is essentially true. A captured German pilot, brought in while the wreckage was still burning, gestured at the destroyed Thunderbolts and asked the American officers what they thought of that. The reply came back that new aircraft would be flown in from the depots within a day or two, and then a question in return. How long would it take Germany to replace the pilots it had just lost? That was the whole war in one exchange. The Allies lost several hundred aircraft in Bodenplatte and had them replaced inside a week. The Luftwaffe lost around 280 aircraft and, far more importantly, over 200 pilots, including squadron commanders and instructors, who could not be manufactured in Indiana. Because that is what was happening in Indiana. Republic built 15,683 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. The plant at Farmingdale on Long Island ran continuously. A second plant at Evansville, Indiana, was built on farmland in 1942 and was turning out hundreds of aircraft a month by 1944. Each aircraft was assembled from tens of thousands of individual parts, with miles of electrical wiring, and an engine containing thousands of components machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Much of that work was done by people who had never seen the inside of a factory before 1941, a large share of them women, and the quality control records show them holding tolerances that would have been considered demanding in peacetime. The ammunition arithmetic is harder to hold in your head than the aircraft numbers. Every Thunderbolt sortie loaded 3,400 rounds. Multiply by the number of aircraft flying daily missions, and American consumption of 50 caliber ammunition ran into the tens of millions of rounds a month, produced at plants like Lake City in Missouri, each cartridge made to a tolerance tight enough to feed reliably through a gun in a freezing wing at 30,000 feet. The guns were electrically heated so they would not seize in the cold. Every one of them had its own charging system. Even the ammunition boxes had powered feed assists so the belts would not jam under high G. None of that is glamorous. All of it is why the guns worked when a pilot pressed the trigger over Germany, and why German pilots kept describing American fire as an unbroken stream rather than a burst. The training numbers finished the argument. By 1944, the United States was graduating more pilots in a year than Germany had trained during the entire war. An American fighter pilot typically arrived in a combat squadron with well over 300 hours in his logbook, a substantial chunk of it in the type he was going to fight in. He had shot at towed targets. He had studied gun camera film. He had been briefed on captured German aircraft and knew what a 109 could and could not do. His German counterpart in late 1944 was arriving with a fraction of that. Fuel shortages had gutted the training schools. The instructors had been pulled into combat units and killed. A young man was being handed a Bf-109, an aircraft that was genuinely difficult to land, with barely enough hours to manage the takeoff, and sent up against pilots who had trained longer than he had lived in uniform. The result was not a fair fight, and everyone involved knew it. The Thunderbolt was doing the same work on the other side of the world, under conditions that suited it even better. In the Pacific, distances were enormous, and there was nothing under you but ocean. An aircraft that could take damage and still fly for hours was worth more than one that turned tightly. The 348th Fighter Group under Neil Kirby took P-47s to New Guinea and found that Japanese fighters, built light and fast-turning with almost no armor and unprotected tanks, were exactly the wrong opponents for 8 Brownings. On the 11th of October, 1943, Kirby led a flight of 4 Thunderbolts into a much larger Japanese formation over Wewak and shot down 6 aircraft himself in a single engagement. He received the Medal of Honor for it. He was killed in action the following March. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous fighter pilots, wrote about the shock of meeting the type. Japanese pilots were used to American fighters that came apart when hit. Cannon fire that would have destroyed a P-40 seemed to have no effect on a Thunderbolt, and the return fire was in a different category from anything they had faced. The final Pacific variant, the P-47N, was built around the ocean itself. Larger wing with fuel inside it, longer range, strengthened structure. It escorted B-29s toward Japan, which meant the fighter that could barely reach the French coast in 1943 finished the war flying missions measured in thousands of miles. There was one last thing the Thunderbolt did that nobody had designed it for. When the Messerschmitt Me-262 appeared, it was faster than every piston fighter in the sky by 100 miles an hour and should have been untouchable. In practice, it had 2 vulnerabilities. It was slow and heavy during takeoff and landing, and it could not turn or accelerate the way its speed suggested. Thunderbolt pilots learned to work both problems. They dove from high altitude, arriving with energy the jet could not immediately escape, and they waited near the jet airfields for the moments when a 262 was low, slow, and committed. In November 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer caught an Me-262 in a high-speed dive and shot it down, and he was not the last. The jets could not survive being hit. They were lightly built, and their engines were fragile, and a single pass from 8 guns tended to remove pieces that the aircraft needed. The final development of the line, the P-47M, was built specifically for this. Water injection and a more powerful engine variant pushed it past 470 miles an hour in level flight, which made it the fastest Thunderbolt ever built and one of the fastest piston fighters to see combat. It went to the 56th Fighter Group, the same unit that had lost so many aircraft, learning to fly the type in Connecticut 3 years earlier. Its pilots used it to hunt jets, and they caught them. Add up what the Thunderbolt did, and the numbers stop feeling like statistics. In Europe, P-47 pilots were credited with over 3,700 German aircraft destroyed in the air, and roughly 3,300 more destroyed on the ground. They claimed 9,000 locomotives and tens of thousands of railway cars, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. In the Pacific, the aerial total ran near 700, with hundreds more destroyed on their fields. Thunderbolt units flew over 500,000 combat sorties and fired something in the region of 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The loss rate across all those sorties was about 7 aircraft per thousand, the lowest of any American fighter in the theater. Behind those figures sits the number that actually decided the war in the air. The German fighter arm lost something on the order of 28,000 pilots killed fighting the Western Allies. Each of those men represented years of instruction that Germany could no longer replace, and by the end, the average German fighter pilot going into combat had a handful of hours of experience while the American he met had hundreds. The most honest assessment of what happened came from the man best placed to give it. Adolf Galland had commanded the German fighter force through the years when it went from mastery to collapse, and he spent the decades after the war talking to the men who had beaten him. His verdict on the P-47 was consistent every time he gave it. The Germans made a mistake in 1943, and the mistake was not tactical. They looked at a large, heavy, ugly aircraft and assumed the Americans did not understand air combat, when in fact the Americans had understood something the Germans had not. Germany was building fighters optimized to win individual duels. America was building a fighter optimized to be produced in enormous numbers, to survive being hit, and to destroy whatever it caught. Galland flew a captured Thunderbolt after the war, and said the experience explained everything. The power was extraordinary. The cockpit was comfortable, and the visibility was excellent. It was, he said, a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. What stayed with him was not the flying qualities, but the realization of what it meant that 15,000 of these complicated machines had been built by a country simultaneously fighting a war on the other side of the planet. Each one needed an engine more complex than anything Germany was producing. They came off the line faster than Germany could build simpler fighters. That, he said, was the point at which he understood there had never been a chance. The men on the receiving end had a name for the guns. Some of them called the sound Roosevelt's piano, because 8 Brownings hammering in unison had a rhythm to it that carried over the noise of the engine and stayed in the memory. Pilots who heard it and lived would describe it 40 years later and still get the details right. Many of their friends heard it once. Look at what the joke had become. In April 1943, the Luftwaffe was laughing at a fighter that could not turn, could not climb, and looked like a barrel with wings. The laughter was not unreasonable. On the numbers that mattered to a German fighter pilot in 1943, the P-47 was worse than what he was flying, and the first month of combat proved it. What the laughter missed was that the Americans were not trying to build a better Focke-Wulf. They were building an aircraft around 3 things Germany could not match at scale. It could operate where German engines could not breathe. It could absorb punishment that would have destroyed anything else and bring its pilot back to fly again. And it carried enough concentrated firepower that a pilot did not need to be exceptional to be lethal, which mattered enormously when one side was producing thousands of pilots a year and the other side was running out. By May 1945, the Thunderbolt was operating from captured German airfields, taking off from concrete the Luftwaffe had poured, flying over a country where the fighter force that had once found it hilarious no longer existed in any meaningful form. There was no fuel for the aircraft that remained. There were no instructors left to train the boys being handed cockpits. There was nobody left on those fields to hold his hands apart and make the old joke about the flying milk bottle. The aircraft that could not turn and could not climb ended the war as the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced, with more airframes built than any other American fighter, flown by young men who had been in high school 4 years earlier, and maintained in muddy fields by mechanics who had learned the trade in a matter of weeks. They stopped laughing sometime in the winter of 1943. By then, the sound had already started, and once you had heard it coming down out of the sun, there was very little you could do except get out of the way and hope the pilot up there had picked somebody else.